So there's a free speech legal battle that's still being waged in the country in a variety of different ways. So look at this story, which hasn't made headlines in many outlets, even though I think it should. This is the New York Times. Like lots of Americans, Robert Fries is not shy about expressing his views on the internet. Last year, in a comment on a newspaper's Facebook page, he said a New Hampshire police officer who had given him a traffic citation was, quote, a dirty cop. The police chief, Mr. Fries added, was a coward who had covered up the matter. The police officers might have looked the other way. They might have responded, explaining their positions and letting readers decide who was right. They might have filed a civil suit for libel, seeking money from Mr. Fries. Instead, they did a fourth thing, one that seems at odds with the American commitment to free expression, particularly where criticism of government officials is concerned. They arrested Mr. Fries, saying he had committed criminal libel. So they arrested a guy for criticizing a police officer. So they go on and say this: about half of states have laws making libel a crime, and prosecutions are not uncommon. About 25 people were charged with violating New Hampshire's law from 2009 to 2017. Convictions happen about 20 times per year throughout the country. Now, the ACLU jumped in, and here's what they say. The cop shouldn't have the power to arrest you for insulting them. It violates the First Amendment, so we're suing. They go on to explain that all of these laws, like the idea in theory of banning libel or slander, it's not totally wrong, because you can't have people purposefully making up malicious lies to destroy somebody, defame somebody, and stuff like that. And I think we all get that there is a line somewhere there. But what they say is, no, the laws that exist now are all so vague that the real purpose of them is to allow the police to basically go after anybody that they don't like. That's what the ACLU is arguing. All these laws are so insanely vague that if the police are so inclined, they can just arrest you for something you say, like this, because they got their own fucking snowflake feelings hurt and they need a safe space. I mean, that's what happened here. Guys, like, you're a dirty cop. Okay, now I'm going to arrest you. What? And by the way, hilarious, what's it called? The Streisand effect, I think, here, where now more people hear about this story because you arrested the guy. So nobody would have known that you were called a dirty cop before, because how many people are looking at your fucking shitty Facebook page? Some random police department. Nobody's looking at that. But now you sued him, and now I'm talking about it, so it's going to be another fucking 40,000 people hearing about it. And then there's going to be other people who cover this. The New York Times was in it. Or the New York Times, covered it. And others are going to cover, some others are going to cover it. I don't expect it to go too far, but it'll get some legs. So now more people know that you're a dirty cop. And by the way, way to prove him right, because if you arrest him for simply insulting you, that kind of proves his point that you're not, like, you have no clear moral lines and principles. Because somebody who's moral in that situation would say what? Yeah, I'm just not gonna arrest him because he's legally allowed to insult me. Instead, you arrested him. I mean, that's nuts, man. That's nuts. Like, there's a reason why we have freedom of speech. And it's always better to lean more on the side of freedom than on the side of authoritarianism and controlling speech. Again, that doesn't mean it's free speech anarchy, but it does mean free speech absolutism. So the distinction that I make on that front is free speech anarchy is nothing, no rules under any circumstances ever. That I don't think is realistic or reasonable. But what I do think is reasonable is, as much as possible, you lean on the side of freedom of speech. And really the only things that should be illegal, libel, slander, but actually to a clear standard, provable beyond any reasonable doubt, not vague at all, and most importantly, direct threats of violence. And in terms of the social media sites, doxing I'm against too. That shouldn't be allowed. Some sort of malicious doxing where you give somebody's personal information and then there's harassment and all that. Like, that also should be against the rules. But outside of that, you have to lean as heavily as possible on the side of free speech. And who can read this story and not walk away with the same conclusion? Which is, obviously, the authorities, they're not like these holier-than-thou overlords. They're regular people. So obviously the authorities should not be given the ability to crack down on regular people in an authoritarian way because they don't like things you said. So this is reason number 9,716 why we know free speech being the default is the way to go. And the final point here is, I really do find this incredible. I really do, that whenever we have a real story involving freedom of speech, like even the legal principle, all the so-called free speech warriors are nowhere to be found. Like, the free speech warriors only like to talk about free speech when they could go after some pink-haired college kid who's censoring people. That's the only time they like to talk about it. That's it. They never like to talk about it when it's an actual legal threat to free speech. Over 20 states have anti-Israel boycott laws. That's literally a threat to free speech. There's court cases going on right now. 2 courts, one in Arizona, one in Kansas, said, yeah, you can't. The government can't say up front, no, we're not going to do any contracts with businesses if the business or the owner of the business happens to support a boycott of Israel. Are you kidding me? Imagine you losing your livelihood because you support a boycott of Saudi Arabia or because you support sanctions on North Korea. That's an economic crackdown on North Korea. That's the same as saying I want to economically boycott, in principle, Israel. That's the same principle at work there. But one's totally allowed and is the norm, and the other one you're not legally not allowed to do, or you lose your livelihood. That's a fucking crackdown on free speech. Here's a literal crackdown on free speech. A fucking police department not liking an insult and then arresting somebody. And the so-called free speech warriors are nowhere to be found. It's almost like they use it as a political weapon. And they don't really believe in it as a matter of principle. Pretty embarrassing and pretty pathetic if you ask me.